What really happens when an empath finally stops living to please everyone? When they stop masking the truth with endless kindness and start to see clearly? Carl Jung uncovered something both unsettling and extraordinary. They don't turn cold or selfish as many might assume. Instead, they become dangerous, not in a way that harms others, but to every system, every relationship, every unspoken rule that has profited from their relentless giving. Jung named this powerful shift individuation. It is, in fact, the most threatening transformation an empath can undergo in a world carefully constructed on their quiet self-sacrifice. Imagine the moment when everything tilts. You're sitting alone, drained from yet another long day of absorbing other people's storms. You've nodded along when you wanted to resist, whispered yes when your whole being screamed no. You've forced a smile to soothe others while your own pain tightened in silence. And then, in a single pause that feels heavier than a lifetime, something different breaks through. Instead of pushing forward in the old, familiar way, you stop. You ask yourself the forbidden question that reshapes everything: what if I stopped? That question, Jung argued, marks the very birth of consciousness.
For the empath who dares to face it honestly, there is no return to the comforting fog of unawareness. Yet here lies the truth Jung discovered, but few dare to discuss. The empath's ability to feel everything as if it were their own is not purely a gift. It is what could be called survival sensitivity, a trauma-honed response carefully disguised as compassion. Jung noticed this repeating thread in countless patients. He once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But how can empaths ever become who they truly are when they've never known themselves apart from the emotions of others? That is the silent tragedy. Let me tell you what truly unfolds in that first shattering instant of awakening. The empath doesn't gently blossom into awareness step by step. They collide head-on with the unconscious, a jarring, almost violent realization that their entire sense of self has been woven from a single falsehood: the belief that they are responsible for everyone else's feelings. Jung described this very pattern in his work on individuation. He saw how highly sensitive individuals often build what he called inflated compassion, a dependency on being needed, because without that role, they fear they are nothing.
They begin to equate their worth with the weight they carry for others. But when that fragile bubble bursts, when the illusion finally cracks wide open, something extraordinary happens. The real self begins to emerge. This is where Jung's insights become nothing short of revolutionary for empaths. He discovered that every individual carries what he called the shadow, all the hidden pieces of ourselves we've denied, rejected, or buried deep out of fear or shame. But for empaths, this shadow holds something far more unexpected, something that unsettles the image people project onto them. Buried within is not weakness or fragility, but rage. Pure, undiluted rage at being used, manipulated, overlooked, and taken for granted. Jung famously wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this darkness is not evil. It is their suppressed anger, their unmet needs, their silenced voice crying out for recognition. And when they finally dare to meet this shadow face to face, the world around them begins to shift in ways that cannot be reversed. The empath who discovers their shadow does not turn bitter or cruel. Instead, they become what I call consciously selective. They begin to see with a new clarity. Subtle manipulation tactics that once slipped by unnoticed suddenly stand out. The charm of emotional vampires no longer blinds them. They can distinguish between a genuine plea for help and a manufactured crisis designed to trap them. This is not cynicism, it is clarity sharpened by truth. Jung observed this repeatedly and described it as a crucial stage in individuation, the moment when the highly sensitive finally awaken to their own power. It shows up in patterns, what I call the 8 signs of conscious awakening. And if you recognize even a few of these within yourself, you may already be stepping into what Jung described as the birth of psychological sovereignty. Sign 1, the energy shift. The very first sign is what I describe as the energy reversal. Instead of your life force constantly flowing outward to meet the needs of others, it begins to gather, to pull back into yourself. Jung witnessed this over and over in his patients. The moment they stopped unconsciously giving themselves away, a startling transformation occurred. They suddenly had energy of their own. Imagine no longer feeling drained after every social interaction, no longer absorbing every passing storm of other people's moods. Most importantly, imagine shedding the guilt that once haunted you simply for setting boundaries. Jung captured it in his words, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." And here's the fascinating twist. Others notice this shift even before you fully grasp it yourself. People sense you are no longer available as their emotional dumping ground, and some will desperately try to guilt you back into your old role. Sign 2, the mask falls away. Jung called this the death of the persona, the collapse of the social mask we wear to fit in. For empaths, that mask is almost always the same, the agreeable one, the helpful one, the endlessly patient one who never dares to say no. But when individuation begins, this mask grows unbearable. You can no longer tolerate it pressing against your true self. Suddenly, you speak your real thoughts instead of tailoring them to what people want to hear. You voice preferences rather than silently deferring. You admit exhaustion rather than pretending to have infinite reserves of energy. And this unsettles those who once benefited from your quiet erasure. Jung warned of this very phase. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But for the empath in the midst of awakening, the balance shifts. Self-acceptance becomes not only more urgent, but far more vital than social acceptance. Sign 3, the projection returns. This is the stage where Jung's insight becomes absolutely crucial. He discovered that much of what we think we see in others is actually a mirror of ourselves, our own qualities unconsciously projected outward. For empaths, this projection is particularly powerful. They often project their sensitivity, their emotional depth, their ability to genuinely care onto people who, in reality, may not possess these traits at all. But during individuation, a shift occurs, what I call the projection recall. It is the moment when the veil of illusion finally lifts. You stop clinging to imagined potential and instead begin to see people as they truly are. You no longer excuse destructive patterns with comforting stories like, "They're just misunderstood." You no longer convince yourself that neglect or selfishness is somehow accidental. Instead, reality comes into focus, sharp and undeniable. Jung captured this truth when he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." For the empath, This means realizing that the irritation they've long felt towards selfishness was not random. It was because they had suppressed their own healthy form of selfishness for far too long. Sign 4, boundaries become sacred. Jung noted that individuals who grow into psychological maturity form what he described as a personal relationship with the unconscious. For empaths, this shift feels like finally tuning into their own inner signals instead of drowning in the noise of external demands. Boundaries, once seen as harsh or unkind, now become sacred. You begin saying no with clarity and without feeling the need to deliver endless explanations. You stop apologizing for having needs, stop shrinking yourself just to keep others comfortable. And here's the telling part. You recognize that those who rage against your boundaries were the very ones who benefited most from your lack of them. This isn't cruelty, it's integrity. Jung referred to this as individual integrity, and the awakening empath discovers within it what I call sacred selfishness. The profound understanding that caring for yourself is not only acceptable, but absolutely necessary if you wish to build authentic, lasting connections with others. Sign 5, the guilt disappears. Perhaps the most shocking sign for empaths is the sudden lightness that comes when the crushing weight of guilt begins to dissolve. The guilt for having needs, the guilt for taking up space, the guilt for disappointing others. It starts to vanish like mist burned away by the sun. Jung described this as the integration of the shadow, the point at which you no longer reject parts of yourself, but welcome them into wholeness. And when you no longer see yourself as broken, you stop feeling guilty simply for being human. You realize, often with startling clarity, that much of your guilt was never yours at all. It was planted there by the subtle manipulation of others. So when someone now sighs in disappointment and says, "You've changed," instead of scrambling to reassure them, you smile inwardly and think, "Yes, I have." And that was the whole point. Jung once wrote, "The individual has always been unconscious of himself and has remained so." But the awakening empath defies this pattern. They become deeply conscious of their own worth, no longer dependent on how others perceive them. Sign 6, authenticity over approval. Jung's individuation process ultimately points toward what he called self-actualization, living not from borrowed expectations, but from your authentic core. For empaths, this is a turning point of profound importance. They begin to choose authenticity over approval, even when that choice comes with a cost. You stop putting on a performance to keep the peace. You no longer manufacture emotions just to make others comfortable. You refuse to pretend agreement when you feel resistance, or laugh at jokes that fall flat simply to avoid awkwardness. At first, this honesty can feel raw, even risky, but soon you notice how liberating it becomes. And the world notices too. This authenticity acts like a magnet for some. It draws in those who respect and cherish your truth. But it also unsettles others, especially those who once relied on your compliance. For many empaths, this moment becomes a line in the sand, the recognition that their backbone has changed the way people treat them forever. They sense the change before I even announce it. The awakening empath begins to discover what I call authentic magnetism. The moment you stop exhausting yourself to be liked by everyone, something remarkable happens. You become naturally attractive to the right people, those who are drawn not to your compliance, but to your truth. Sign 7, the healer heals themselves. Jung uncovered that many healers fall into the category he called wounded healers. They pour themselves into fixing others, often as a way to avoid turning inward and facing their own unhealed pain. But during individuation, the empath's focus finally shifts. For the very first time, their healing gifts are directed inward. You start asking, "What do I need?" instead of constantly asking, "What does everyone else need?" You begin tending to your own neglected wounds, nurturing your inner child rather than endlessly parenting every adult around you. You realize with startling clarity that you cannot pour endlessly from an empty cup, and that you've been running on empty for years. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For the awakening empath, this privilege comes alive when they finally give themselves permission to explore who they are beyond the identity of caretaker, beyond the role of emotional savior. Sign 8, conscious connection. Final sign is what Jung described as conscious relationship, the rare ability to connect deeply with others without dissolving into them. For the empath in awakening, this emerges as what I call boundaried compassion. You still feel for others, but you no longer absorb their storms as if they were your own. Instead, you start attracting people who respect your limits rather than those who prey on your generosity. Relationships evolve into exchanges of mutual respect instead of one-sided giving. You discover the power of loving others without needing to rescue them. And if you've reached the stage where you can read people without craving their approval, you'll recognize the freedom in saying, "I see you, but I don't need you." Jung observed that individuation leads to richer, more authentic connections because for the first time, you are relating as your true self, not as a carefully crafted persona. But Jung never romanticized this transformation. He called it the night sea journey, a passage through darkness, disorientation, and loss that is necessary for rebirth. For empaths, it feels almost like death, and in many ways it is the death of the false self that was built on pleasing others. You may lose friends who only cherished the version of you that served their needs. You may feel waves of loneliness as you learn, perhaps for the very first time, how to simply be with yourself. You may grieve relationships that, when stripped bare, were never truly based on love but on your usefulness. Jung expressed it starkly. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The awakening empath must descend into their own psychological underworld before rising toward authentic selfhood. And Jung was also one of the first to recognize the deep, inseparable link between mind and body. For empaths, years, sometimes decades, of carrying the weight of others' emotions builds what I call energetic toxicity. It shows up in the body as chronic fatigue, relentless anxiety, digestive troubles, and even autoimmune conditions. But when empaths begin to shed the chains of people-pleasing, something profound occurs. Their bodies, like their minds, finally begin to heal. The nervous system finally begins to relax. For the first time in what feels like years, sleep improves. Chronic pain, once constant and heavy, often starts to diminish. Jung understood something profound. Psychological healing and physical healing are inseparable, two sides of the same process. After all, your body was never designed to carry the burden of processing everyone else's emotional waste. And when you stop being the world's emotional landfill, when you stop absorbing what was never yours to hold, your health naturally begins to restore itself. Jung observed that individuation doesn't just reshape the inner world, it inevitably changes relationships too. Some bonds grow deeper and stronger, while others quietly fade or fracture. For empaths, this sorting process can be painful, but it is also absolutely necessary. What I call the Great Relationship Purge serves as a filter that separates genuine, soul-level connections from those that were always exploitative. The truth becomes clear: people who truly love you will adapt to your new boundaries and celebrate your growth, while those who resist your changes were likely the very ones who profited from your self-neglect. Jung described this distinction as the separation between genuine love and neurotic attachment. And when you see it plainly, you begin to recognize how many of your past relationships were actually built on an unspoken, unconscious contract. You provided endless emotional support. In return, they offered conditional acceptance. But when you finally break this contract, when you claim your own life, some people will leave. And as painful as it may feel, the healthiest response is simple: let them. Here is what Jung discovered that truly changes everything. When empaths stop being everyone's emotional sponge, they do not lose their sensitivity. They develop something stronger, sharper, and far more sustainable, what I call conscious sensitivity. It is the ability to still feel deeply, but to do so with choice, with discernment. You begin to decide what to absorb and what to release. This conscious sensitivity, far from being a weakness, becomes a superpower. With it, you can read situations with striking accuracy without drowning in them. You can help others without depleting yourself. You can love with great depth, but without losing your center in the process. Jung called this differentiated consciousness, the rare ability to stay grounded in your own identity while still connecting intimately with others. The awakening empath in this way transforms into what Jung named a conscious individual, someone who moves through the world with sensitivity intact, but boundaries unshakable. Jung also believed that personal transformation ripples outward into collective change. When even one person becomes conscious, it silently gives others permission to do the same. The empath who breaks free from people-pleasing does more than change their own life. They model a different way of being for everyone in their orbit. Your courage to set boundaries gives others courage to set theirs. Your refusal to carry the weight of everyone else's emotions teaches others that they too can be responsible for their own feelings. And your authentic self-expression becomes a living reminder that no one needs to perform in order to be worthy of love. Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But he also noted this transformation only happens when at least one person shows up authentically, unmasked, and real. This is why he identified specific principles that guide individuated people, what I call the conscious empath's code. 5 principles maintain psychological sovereignty while still allowing deep connection with others. The first: feel everything, absorb nothing. Your emotions belong to you, their emotions belong to them. The second: give from overflow, never from depletion. True generosity flows from abundance, not from exhaustion. The third: love others without losing yourself. The fourth: help when inspired, not when guilty. And the fifth: trust your inner knowing over external pressure. These are not rigid rules, but guiding principles, anchors for maintaining what Jung described as authentic being in a world that constantly profits from your unconscious self-abandonment. Jung understood that society is quick to label individual consciousness as selfish because unconscious people inevitably benefit from others' self-neglect. So when empaths begin prioritizing their own needs, when they finally dare to say no and live from center, they are often accused of becoming cold, detached, even uncaring. But Jung made a critical distinction here, the difference between healthy selfishness and unhealthy selfishness. Healthy selfishness means taking responsibility for your own happiness instead of handing that responsibility to others. It means building boundaries, not rigid walls,
but living borders that protect without isolating. It means choosing self-care over self-abandonment. The awakening empath eventually realizes that caring for themselves is not an indulgence, it is essential. Because truly, how can you pour into others if your own cup has been empty for years? Jung's concept of individuation also includes what he called the inner marriage, the integration of the masculine and feminine principles within a single psyche. For empaths, this means balancing their natural receptivity with a healthy assertiveness. You learn to receive as much as you give, to say no as confidently as you say yes.
You begin to integrate your nurturing nature with your deep need for independence. This is what Jung called psychological wholeness, the state where you no longer need someone else to complete you, because you have discovered how to complete yourself. In this wholeness, the awakening empath learns they can be both soft and strong, both caring and boundaried, both sensitive and sovereign. Jung also recognized that highly sensitive individuals carry unique gifts that often remain buried until they learn to consciously manage their sensitivity. This is what I call the empath's arsenal, abilities that emerge not when sensitivity is suppressed, but when it is embraced and channeled. Intuition sharpens into razor accuracy when it isn't clouded by absorbing other people's emotions. Creative expression flows freely when your energy is no longer drained by emotional vampires. And in this state, deep and meaningful relationships finally begin to form. Not with those who exploit your kindness, but with those who match your authenticity. Jung captured this shift when he wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. The conscious empath develops a vision that cuts cleanly through pretense to see the truth." Yet Jung also observed that individuation almost always involves a season of loneliness, a passage marked by separation from the unconscious group dynamics that once defined belonging. For empaths, this loneliness can feel almost overwhelming. You've spent an entire lifetime surrounded by people who needed you, family, friends, partners, colleagues, and suddenly you find yourself stepping back, learning to be alone in a way you never have before. But Jung made an important distinction. There is a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection from others, the hollow space left when external validation fades. Solitude, by contrast, is the quiet joy of discovering connection with yourself. The awakening empath begins, often for the very first time, to enjoy their own company. In solitude, you hear the clear sound of your own thoughts without the static of other people's emotions drowning them out. You begin to notice your true preferences unshaped by the weight of others' expectations. And in that stillness, you finally meet yourself, perhaps more authentically than ever before. But Jung's individuation process does not end in withdrawal or isolation. Its purpose is not to cut ties with the world, but to prepare for something deeper, conscious re-engagement. The awakening empath eventually returns to relationships and community, yet now It is done from choice rather than compulsion. You help others when it flows naturally, not when guilt pushes you forward. You join social interactions when you desire genuine connection, not because you fear rejection. You share your gifts with the world out of fullness, not out of a desperate need to be needed. Jung called this conscious participation a way of engaging with life as your true self, not the performing self that once kept everyone else comfortable. He also understood that psychological growth is never a straight line. Development happens in cycles. For the awakening empath, there will be challenges along the path, times when boundaries feel shaky, moments of doubt, old patterns whispering for your return. Yet with each cycle, something profound happens. Every challenge deepens your understanding. Every test of will strengthens your resolve. Every boundary you hold firm makes the next one easier to honor. Jung referred to this as spiral development, the recognition that you revisit familiar themes again and again, but each time at a deeper level of consciousness. The key is seeing these repetitions not as failures, but as essential steps in the process of growth. Jung also believed individuation carries with it a natural responsibility. When you begin to heal yourself, an organic desire arises to help others heal. But here the conscious empath's mission transforms. It is no longer about rescuing others or carrying their burdens. Instead, you model what healthy boundaries look like.
You hold space for others' pain without absorbing it into your own body. You trust people to find their own solutions instead of rushing to fix everything for them. This, Jung explained, is authentic service, helping not from your wounds, but from your wholeness. You become like a lighthouse on a rocky shore, steady, radiant, illuminating the path for those ready to see. But unlike before, you don't chase ships lost in the dark. You allow them to find their own way when they are prepared. Jung's ultimate vision was the realization of what he called the self, not the fragile ego or the mask of the persona Bauja,
but the integrated totality of who you truly are. For empaths, reaching this integration means embracing every part of themselves without exclusion. The sensitive and the strong, the gentle and the fierce, the giver and the receiver, all of it belongs. You no longer apologize for feeling deeply, nor do you hide or suppress the intuitive gifts that have always been part of you. Instead of shrinking yourself to fit into narrow, simple categories, you embrace the richness of your complexity. You begin to see that what once made you feel too much is actually the very thing that makes you whole. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The integrated empath embodies this truth fully, both powerful and gentle, both open and boundaried, both connected to others, yet sovereign in themselves. So here's what I want you to understand. Your sensitivity is not your weakness. It is your greatest strength. Your boundaries are not selfishness. They are an act of profound self-respect. And your authenticity is not too much. It is, in fact, exactly what the world needs. Jung dedicated his life to studying the process of becoming whole, and he discovered it always demands courage. The courage to disappoint others in order to remain faithful to yourself. The courage to stand alone rather than betray your deepest values. The courage to choose growth even when comfort whispers for you to stay small. Without this courage, individuation cannot take root. If you recognize yourself in these 8 signs, then know this: you are already walking the path Jung mapped out more than a century ago. Trust the process, even when it feels uncertain. Trust your instincts, even when others doubt them. And above all, trust that becoming who you truly are is not just your right, it is your responsibility. If you see yourself reflected in these transformation patterns, affirm it with these words. My breaking point became my breakthrough. When an empath stops pleasing everyone and begins to see reality clearly, they don't become selfish. They step into sovereignty. They don't lose their compassion. They expand it to finally include themselves. They don't stop caring about others. They learn to care for themselves alongside others. This, at its heart, is Jung's enduring gift to every empath who has grown tired of carrying the weight of being the world's emotional caretaker. You no longer need to carry the world's pain to prove your goodness. You no longer need to sacrifice yourself to feel worthy of love. You can embody both sensitivity and strength, both care and boundaries, both empathy and authenticity. What the world needs is not more depleted empaths. It needs conscious ones. Empaths who give from choice, not compulsion, who help from a place of abundance, not from emptiness, who love without abandoning themselves in the process. And if you want to go even deeper into Jung's psychology of the sovereign individual, I invite you to explore my video on Why the Man Who Needs Nothing is Society's Greatest Threat, where I reveal how psychological independence challenges systems built on dependency. Because your journey from people-pleaser to conscious empath is not only personal transformation, it is nothing short of revolutionary. And if Jung were here today, he would no doubt be proud. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next dimension.